And I told this guy like, hey, I would love to tell you something. Here's what I'm building. What do you think of this? And I remember very clearly that he said, oh, this is Carta, but for debt.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to La Frontera, a podcast dedicated to exploring the dynamic startup and venture capital ecosystem in Latin America and the innovators behind it all. We're your hosts, Cyrus and Tom. If you enjoy this conversation, we invite you to subscribe to our newsletter where we announce new episodes and share additional insights and resources for founders and investors alike. We'd also like to invite you to share this podcast with your friends and to leave a review on Spotify, Apple, or YouTube to help more people discover the show. We love hearing from our audience. You can connect with us on LinkedIn and Twitter by searching for La Frontera Podcast. In this episode, we talk to Valentina Valencia, founder and CEO of Vaas, about how she's unlocking capital markets in LatAm by automating asset-backed private debt transactions. As a Latina founder who started in Silicon Valley, Valen shares why she returned to build in Colombia, how she raised early VC funding from Andreessen with just a vision, no product, no traction, and the lessons she learned along the way. We also dive into how Vaas is making private debt markets more efficient in Mexico and Colombia and get an inside look at Colombia's thriving startup scene.
All right, welcome to another episode of La Frontera. Today we're here with Valentina Valencia. She's the founder and CEO of Vaas. We've been looking forward to this conversation for a while. So Valen, thank you so much for taking time to chat with us.
Well, thank you. We have to chat one way or another, either within Vaas or outside of Vaas. Just for context, like Tommy was supposed to join as an intern, but then he preferred another startup. I don't remember which one. Not throwing shade at all. Just saying.
No, it's tough. It's tough, you know. I think like deep down though, I think the reason that I decided not to join Vaas is because you still haven't accepted my LinkedIn request.
Is that it?
Yeah. Sorry, I keep grudges for a while, but hopefully we can move past it.
I accept that as the right reason.
Yeah, you accepted mine before his, which, I feel special now.
Okay, well,
right now.
I spent the summer in Mexico City. It was a good time with Connecta, but I'm definitely excited to hear what you guys have been up to since then. So the last time we chatted was May, but we can talk about definitely Vaas. We'll dig into specifics and what you guys are up to, but would love to start with just in general, a little like abbreviated history of where you came from, where you went, coming to the US, working, and just everything up to, I guess, starting Vaas and what kind of inspired you to start a company.
Yeah. So I was born in the US, but I grew up in Colombia. And I don't know, I think like for many reasons, like I've been very attached to the US. And then in 2012, I decided to move to North Carolina. My mom wanted me to become a speed skater, a world champion. Fortunately, my brother did that in 2010. So the rest of the siblings didn't have to, because I was next. So that definitely wasn't going to happen. Because I wanted to play soccer. So I went to North Carolina. I was there for a year and a half. That's where my English got better or good. And then I think that's where probably I fell in love with math. So I knew that I wanted to do something with math. I had like this incredible teacher. I think in algebra 2 and then statistics, I had 2 different teachers that were like incredible. So I don't know, I wanted to do something in math. And then I moved back to Colombia for my senior year, then applied to a university called Holt. They gave me this big scholarship. And I was basically able to go to San Francisco. And after the first year, I still had to pay for like my living expenses, like stuff is quite expensive, as you all know. So I was basically like in San Francisco, and after the first year, my mom said like, look, I cannot send you like any more money for your living expenses. You're going to have to either come back or figure something out. And I was like, well, I'm already here. I'm going to figure something out. And so basically there was like an internship fair end of freshman year. And I basically saw this Venezuelan guy just like speaking Spanish. I was like, I don't know, I'm just going to go speak Spanish to this guy. And we had this incredible conversation. And basically it was like the head of customer service for PayJoy at the time. I was like, hey, look, I'm looking for a job. I know how to speak English. I know how to speak Spanish. They were looking for, PayJoy initially started lending money in the US. So they needed basically like English speakers for their US clients, plus Spanish speaking for their US clients at that time, but that only spoke Spanish. So that's basically how I got into PayJoy. And 6 years later, I went from customer service at PayJoy to doing like a bunch of stuff in PayJoy, ended up in capital markets. And then I moved to Arclex, which was the first institutional lender that was giving money to PayJoy. So then I jumped there, and that's where I basically learned everything that I know about structured debt, thanks to James. And here I am.
Got it. And enter Vaas, right? So like, we definitely want to hear, I guess, a simple kind of explanation of what you guys do and what kind of incepted the idea. The other thing, talking to Juliana, like prepping for, this conversation, she was like, don't ask her kind of like what the problem is she's solving. Ask for like vision, Yeah, so
Interesting.
I'll just put a little of that in there.
Okay. I'll answer the vision later. But I don't know what your audience looks like, but I'm going to go with supposedly no one knows about structured debt. The best way that I have been able to explain this is imagine that you tell me you're going to lend money to Cyrus. And so you will tell Cyrus, hey, Cyrus, in order for me to lend you that $1, I'm going to basically take something in guarantee. And I see a plant behind Cyrus' backs. It's an incredible plant. So we should put it higher than $1 because then it's not going to be fair to the plant. Let's put it at $100. So it's $100. Basically what Tommy is going to lend to Cyrus, and then Cyrus is going to give the plant in guarantee to Tommy. So basically what ends up happening is that when Cyrus pays the money back to Tommy, well, Cyrus will want his plant back. Now, the question is, how do we know that Tommy hasn't sold off the plant, or I don't know, you're traveling down to Mexico eating tacos and you didn't water the plant? So basically you didn't take care of this like beautiful plant.
It actually happened this summer. My roommate killed all our plants. That's Mexico. So
did you?
I'm trying.
Okay.
I don't know.
This plant was barely hanging on by the time I got back from Mexico.
Oh, that says a lot about the plant. You see, now it's at $200.
Yeah.
No, so basically the question is, how do you know that when Cyrus sends the plant to Tommy and Tommy sends the $1,000, how do they know like this beautiful background that I'm seeing? It's about not a fake plant. And then all of a sudden what Thomas has received is like an actual like picture of a plant and not the actual plant. Well, imagine this of the plant being like an asset, where an asset can be a mortgage or like a house. It can be an invoice. It can be like equipment, or it can be aircraft leasing, whatever the asset that may be, that is basically being used as a guarantee for a loan. What we're trying to do in Vaas is make sure that that plant or that asset is real. And then what basically Cyrus is saying, Tommy can trust it, because Vaas is saying, hey, look, based on everything that we agreed to on what is going to make this plant real, based on these 5 things, this plant seems to check all of this off. But imagine if not with plants, but just like hundreds of thousands of assets that are being originated by buy now, pay later companies, by factoring companies that basically factor invoices. You could think of people that are doing iBuyer models and they're buying houses, and so they have to put the house on an SPV or on a trust. So I'm not sure if that's a good explanation. I'm not sure also how much Cyrus knowledge is about structured debt. I know, Kwame, so I'm going to base my answer on, or my good understanding based on Cyrus' answers.
Yeah, that was great. Yeah, Cyrus actually worked with me at Fannie Mae.
How good is that explanation?
That's pretty good. I like it. So I had a question though to follow up.
Okay.
So obviously asset-backed lending, you have to make sure that this asset, whatever that might be, for example, let's go with like invoice factoring. Do you guys perform any sort of valuation to assert to the value of that asset? If you're backing a specific loan, do you guys do that? Is that another third party that you contract with or you work with the platform to do that? And then with that asset, do you handle the delivery of that asset? Is that also kind of how you guys work?
So I'll try to answer from a different perspective, from different angles. So on the first one, which is like, hey, here's $100,000 invoice. How much should someone advance against that invoice? That is not a decision score that I create. That's basically going to be the credit policy from this factoring company. So if they say, based on their metrics, it's 75 or 76%, that's going to be what the credit policy says from this originator. So basically the answer is no to assessing what the LTV should be in order to take risks. So we don't take risk decisions per se. Let's move to the right. Okay, so someone has sent the $70,000. They have received $100,000 of basically invoice being assigned to that SPV or to that trust. What we do at that point is we verify, and it depends by jurisdictions because different jurisdictions has different ways of doing this, but I'll give you like an example. In Colombia, we have something called Radian. And what that effectively does is that, actually, it's kind of weird, but in the US, we don't have electronic invoices. Like literally like a piece of paper can be an invoice, right? In Colombia, every single invoice needs to go through or through DIAN or through the equivalent of the IRS. It needs to be tagged. And there was this platform called Radian that basically tells you the ownership of that asset. Plus, in addition, you can download all the face value information of that invoice. So what we do is two things. One, we check the face value of the invoice. So if it says SAPI S.A. or LLC or Corp or whatever, like we check 100% the names match with what the loan takes are saying. Plus, in addition, we check that the ownership belongs to that third party that should be getting them. And then in addition to that is the $70,000 is the outstanding principal balance of this chapter. So if let's say a lender wants to advance against this, let's just put it, I don't know, let's say it's 70% advance rate. So I don't know, $49,000 would be basically what the lender would effectively give for that invoice that has a value of 100,000. So we would do the calculation for this one. We would do the calculation for both, but that implied risks that someone is taking, we wouldn't do it. That would basically be more like decision-making risk models. Basically the credit policy that each originator, we don't advise them.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that explanation. We'll take it back to the we'll dive in.
Up a couple floors, thinking about just like the general market in Colombia and then Latin America. Why are you starting this in Colombia and where do you kind of hope to take it?
Can I just say before that I don't know if I can say fucking, but fucking incredible that we can do this conversation like you guys like US perspective and then my perspective in Latin America. So yeah. Thank you for inviting me. And even if it's just the three of us listening to this, I just find it very cool. Why Latin America? One, when I was at Architect, which was this like the second version fund of our clubs, we basically saw a big opportunity where a lot of VC money was going in and there was no one willing to do the work to figure out like how do you perfect the security interest in Mexico and Colombia in different jurisdictions and like go do the work to lend $5 million. Like we were doing like very small lines of credit where it used to take us like 6-12 months to close the transaction. So my background, it's not in the US. Like I lived in the US. I lived in San Francisco. We did a couple of transactions in the US, but basically like 90-something%, it was in Mexico and Colombia. And the biggest problem that I saw, and this is actually a very interesting conversation to have with you guys, which is, you mentioned it like right now the escrow, but I think that's for different purposes. Like imagine like a regular SPV in the US. So let's say that I don't want to call names, but I'm a Fintech originator. I have these assets. I've put these assets, registering the UCT, the type of assets that I'm going to assign to this lender. And I basically like assign those assets or sell those assets into this SPV. And I will just send a borrower and base report at either every day or every week or every month, depending on the cadence of what the lender says. For you to get the money out of the SPV, basically, you don't need the bank or the trustee to approve those wires. Like it depends. There's a lot of ways to go about this, but in the US, like the ways in the operations work is extremely efficient. Mm-hmm. If I want to assign some rights today, I basically create a list, put it on DocuSign, everyone's signing and go. Well, not even everyone. I think only the originator sometimes sign. In the case of Mexico, I'll give you and this was the biggest problem that we had. For you to assign rights into a trust, you need to tell the trustee, hey, I'm assigning these assets to you. You're going to print this list out. You're going to sign it by hand. You got to get a notary to stamp that. And then they send it. And then it's $500 every single signature. So what ended up happening is everyone was like, why in the world would I do daily assignments if I'm going to spend $500 on every single signature? Like I will probably do it perhaps once per month or twice per month. So I decrease my costs. The problem was that a lot of our clients at Architect were like either buy now, pay later, or they had like 30-day loans assets. What that basically meant is that you're only assigning rights once per month. Basically, the trust is doing like this in terms of money or cash, and you can only take that cash out once or twice per month when you assign new rights. Otherwise, you would be in a borrowing-based efficiency. And to me, it was like, it's incredible that just because we need a notary and just because we need to sign like by hand, that you're going to have like 20, 30, 50, 60, $70 million sitting in the account and still paying interest to the lender just because you cannot assign assets. Like, to me, it was like imagine if the structures in the US, you could only remove cash once or twice per month. That's basically what happened in Spanish-speaking LatAm. And I was like, we need to change this. And I basically talked to one of the originators that really had this huge problem. And they were like, V, help me solve this. I was still an architect. And I basically just like drew like high levels, what I would need in order to verify what they were saying on a daily basis. And the CEO was like, oh, we don't have resources for capital markets. And so I was like, it's crazy to me that like, I don't know, like the prime material, like the basic material by which fintechs operate, it's the cash that they can loan out and they have it stuck like in this account. And they are not willing to spend tech resources on this, but then the capital markets people suffer because they're the treasury, they cannot fund assets. And so I was like, what if I just then build this myself? And that's how Vaas came to be. So that's why Mexico and Colombia.
So when you spoke to your potential customers, when you decided that you wanted to start Vaas, how did you go about, and this is something that I feel like a lot of founders have mentioned, but just going from that 0 to 1, those initial couple steps are usually some of the hardest steps that you have. How did you end up starting to build out your team? So how did you go out and find the right kind of engineers that you needed? Did you even start building out a product? Did you start with like wireframing to get like some sort of MVP? Can you talk about that a little bit?
So this is the funny story, but basically a person that I was dating like back in 2021, I don't know if I would consider dating, but this person had a cousin in Ukraine or something. I don't remember where it was. And I asked for references on, hey, do you know anyone that can help me with a wireframe or something? And she was like, yes, here you go. So I got in contact with her cousin and I was like, this guy like knew nothing about structured debt. So now imagine trying to explain, like do a wireframe like structured debt to someone who doesn't know. We basically spent probably like a month or two, like figuring out the wireframes. And I remember that when he was giving like the final comments on the wireframes, I was flying to Mexico. And so I paid like $1,000 for those wireframes. I didn't know anything about Figma. They were incredible wireframes. Perhaps if lots of successful, we can post it one day and whatever. But based on my knowledge of technology, it was very nice. And I flew to Mexico. Actually, no, before I flew to Mexico, I showed the wireframes to one of my friends who basically was an originator that Architect lent money to. And I told this guy like, hey, I would love to tell you something. Here's what I'm building. What do you think of this? And I remember very clearly that he said, oh, this is Carta, but for debt. And I was like, huh. And Carta at that time had launched Carta X, which they eventually shut down, which
that was a crazy episode.
That was a crazy episode, which I actually didn't agree that they should have done that. But that's another conversation. And so basically I told this guy like, hey, here's what I'm building. He said, Carta, look at Carta. And I was like, what if we could create the secondary marketplace for these transactions? And basically imagine like I was trying to solve like an operational problem and then I was trying to build like the secondary and I was thinking, how in the world can I get to like this? To me, in my mind, there was like, man, I have 10 years now of like product roadmap to get there. And at that time I was like, let's just go build it. And I was in Mexico then with this same guy and he had a friend who was basically in the floor upstairs of a restaurant. They saw each other and they were like, hey, you should talk to V. This was Hector from Nazca. He ended up basically trying to lead the round. And I was like, hey, we're going to actually, because I was saving basically my bonuses that I had on Architect to actually fund the company because I didn't think that anyone was going to fund this idea. So at that point, I was like, well, if we're actually going to get VC money and do it as well, let's do it well. So they called Andreessen at that point. Then we received some money. And I think having then Andreessen, the name on the back, that's when I went and hired the team. So I flew to Argentina because through a friend of a friend of a friend, I got introduced to this guy, Javier Simon, which is now my CTO. And he was at Glowant for 10 years. He used to work for banks through Glowant for banks in the US. And then he moved back to Argentina, where he was leading one of the verticals of Mercado Libre. And he wanted to leave. And I got in contact with him and I was like, hey, look, I have this crazy idea. Do you want to jump in? And one of the things that I loved about this guy, as opposed to the other people, it was that he asked so many whys that I was like, oh, he's interesting. Like he's interested. Sorry. Like he's interested in what I'm building. Like everyone else, remember this is like 2021, where it was still like, yes, building a startup is cool and so on.
Yeah.
So a lot of people were trying to leave startups and so on, or the big companies. And it was like, the guy was like, why? But why? And why? And I remember even talking about like NBX. So it was like very cool that we got to like very technical stuff. And he still has the scratch, and I love to scratch. So he still has all these scratches on his notebook. And he said yes, but he said to wait for him a while before he moves out of Mercado Libre. And then, but at that time, there were a lot of people moving out of Mercado Libre because something happened and people were not getting like their raises that they were supposed to. So a lot of people were unhappy and incredible talent. And then it was just like, well, these guys are leaving. You guys should connect. And basically a lot of my team is from Mercado Libre. That's how we got the team. But then what happened with the prototype or this wirephrase is that because the tech guys were joining January, then March, and so on, like we didn't have 10 engineers to work with, but I needed to go prove out like the product very fast. So I had a Juliana, which is the person that made this happen. She was the one doing the logo. And if you guys are very interesting as to why this logo and everything else, she's going to post something very soon. I'll send it to you. But I was like, we need to figure out how to do the first pilot. So she contacted me with a friend of hers that they used to be partners in some other stuff. And I was like, hey, look, I have this issue. Can you help me do the pilot? And they were like, yes. And I remember they charged me like $20,000. So now I had the Andreessen money, right? Like not the $1,000 that I had at the beginning when it was like coming out of my pocket. I was like, okay, let's do the pilot. That allowed us to go like quite fast at the beginning for when the new engineers were coming in they could see already, as opposed to like me trying to explain something, they could see the code and see what it's doing. And the first customer that I went to, it was the customer at Architect that had the biggest problem because they were the only one that didn't raise VC capital. So they were the most cash constrained. And they were like, they actually invested in Vaas. They became investors in Vaas. Like they true, like I would say, like all around, like they're one of my favorite investors because they helped on the investor side. They were actually the reason why I eventually got to the CTO. They were my first clients and so on. So,
and they truly
recognize
the problem that you're solving. Wow, that's an amazing story. I want to back up a little bit because this is also amazing how you're at a job in San Francisco, right? Like you're very young, like mid-20s, and you decide to jump and build a company, right? And getting backed by Andreessen before you even have a team or really like a product to show for it, right? Like how did you navigate that? How did you like establish credibility? How did you like sell that vision so early on?
I think that would be a question for them. I think I probably asked them once and they said that up until that point, at least, and they can check whether this is true because this is what I remember. They basically said something like, you were one of the people that could truly explain the intricacies of what is actually happening. Like my story comes from like PageWay doing customer service, doing collections, doing origination of $100 loans to them doing sales, like finance ops, FP&A, capital markets, then moving to the fund that is doing this, doing audits, operations. Like I just had like this perspective that I had also because I needed the money, but I also love learning and whatever. So that was, I think one was that. I think second, and this is something that I'm very grateful for the people that were in my life at that time. They knew David Haber, who is the GP at Andreessen, and they vouched for me. And so I think like, I guess to summarize, I learned a lot and I knew a lot, but also like throughout the years that I was at PageWay and then Architect, like I made a lot of friends where I've helped a ton. Like a lot of the startup CEOs, like 4 or 5 years ago, they didn't understand what a borrowing base was. And what I loved to do was like getting on an Excel and just showing them and explaining and so on. So I think like, or at least it's my way of thinking, that like when I asked a favor, it all came back. They all vouched for me, or not all, but a couple of people did. And then Hector from NASA was like, I think the first person who said is like, he didn't care about anything. I guess probably the credibility was our friend in common, but he knew that a lot of his startups that he had funded had this issue. So he's like, we need to solve this issue. I don't know. I think it's a question more for them on the credibility or what made them decide.
Well, your passion for the problem is also very evident, like how you speak about it and your knowledge about the whole situation as well. And I think that's something that a lot of VCs also tout is like they want founders that are passionate about the problem, or like they're in love with the problem, not the solution. And I think that comes off from the get-go. So I think that's probably what Andreessen saw.
No, I agree. And now I'm fighting on the opposite way because now I'm like AI full in and my people are like, where's the problem? The other day they sent me the Steve Jobs video where he's like, well, why would we put all of that? Like, I first want to figure out the problem and then figure out the technology that we're going to put on it.
So when you were raising your VC money, did you end up raising from angels as well? Or were you focused on primarily VCs? And as a follow-up to that, most of the VCs, did you go straight to the US market to raise? Or were you also looking at VCs in LatAm? What was your experience with that? A lot of founders that we've spoken to over the last couple of years or so had issues with raising from angels or VCs in the United States that don't really understand the LatAm market. So with this kind of product, how did you end up raising money from VCs in the United States?
So I didn't think that I could raise money from VC, and that's what I was also being told. So I just didn't think that I could raise money. It all came through like this friend that then I met in NASCA, and he was the one that introduced me to Andreessen. So I guess in my soul, I was always looking for a top tier US VC, but some people told me like, not me. So I guess the fact that Hector vouched for me, I remember that it was this email where he's like, he told Gabriel from Andreessen, is like, hey, this is something like very cool. You should look at it. I don't remember what he said. And that's how I got into the intro of Andreessen. So I guess I didn't look for it, except for, of course I did. From like, and back in my mind, I always wanted to have them. That doesn't really answer the question, but.
So from the beginning, were you ever thinking about bootstrapping from the start? Okay. And then you got connected with Hector. And then from there, got connected with like the folks at Andreessen, et cetera, and went from there. And essentially, we were like, okay, well, maybe VC money could be a good fit, could help me, launch this product.
Especially like Hector was like, V, you're going to make a lot of mistakes. You're going to need money. I was like, okay. So it became like this thing of like, now, well, how much money then I raised? And at that point when Hector was like, do this, do this, do this, I remember that I went to San Francisco after being in Mexico. And I remember doing this like, almost like a thesis on capital markets in Latin America. And I was like, okay, let's do it well. Then what am I going to need? So I was thinking Mexico, Colombia, Brazil. Okay, like these would have to be the 3 countries. So I started planning VCs to cover each of the markets. And then what am I going to need? Then I started looking for angel investors that could help me within those specific things. And so I think the angel investors were very cool to bring on. In fact, I have a very full investor from San Francisco that I have probably only talked twice, but in very like crossroad moments of the strategic decisions, like I've called him or not called him, but I've texted him and said, hey, are you available? And he just provided incredible pieces of advice. And I didn't know him. This was also an introduction by Andreessen. So I think Andreessen also, I'm not sure why they didn't try to bring more people on, but I just found it like very cool afterwards.
Yeah, I think they definitely want to bring more people on that are just going to help you out, right? Like in general, like anyone that can in their network that can basically provide you advice and, funding and everything. That's what they do. And then talking a little bit more about fundraising. So it was kind of that hot sweet spot. Like people were kind of funding everything. And so like, I think maybe it ended up working out with like relationships, and obviously it's a very cool problem. You're awesome. It's really like great hearing about like how you're going to solve it and everything. Do you think now, and I'm not sure like if you're trying to raise now or if you have like since then, since the bubble, I guess, burst, people started pulling out of Latin America, especially international investors. Do you think it's harder now? Do you think it's going to be harder? What do you see as like the environment now versus then?
To me, right after like interest rates started to like get like up to like 5%, it was like incredible. I started like thinking about roughly by one point that it goes up the interest rate, like how much does it decrease on like the valuation of someone? And I remember doing like a simple math where it was like roughly about like 5%, it would just decrease, or every 1% would decrease roughly about 10% the value of the company. So at that point, my math was like, I'm worth half. Like everyone is worth half, just purely because of interest rates. So my way of thinking about this is it will only be harder if interest rates don't seem a curve down. And I think LatAm people will start to get comfortable again once there's like much more capital deployment. I think I've heard recently that all of the VC funds in Latin America, or at least a lot of them, are trying to raise money at the same time, and a lot of them can't. So
Not going well, yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's right now like there's just like a freeze of capital. Even when there was like a lot of the things of like, oh, there's like capital everywhere or like dry powder. A lot of people didn't also want to test that dry powder because of the liquidity that was behind the LPs. So I think it's about to get better. Definitely not in the next couple months, but I do think that it's opening up a little bit, and it definitely got worse for everyone globally.
Yeah. I think also I just think like valuations are starting to have like corrected and everything. I don't see interest rates. I mean, interest rates are already coming back down. So hopefully that eases things like a little bit. But I think like those companies that are sound like fundamentally and still are working and growing, I think why stop now from a VC perspective?
Well, if they don't have the capital, it's hard to fund. But I think I think Latin America is just like, there's just so much to do here. Everything is broken. Not everything, but just like a lot of things are broken. So I just think there's a lot to do here.
A lot of opportunity.
Yeah. I remember the first time I ever visited Mexico City, I interviewed a bunch of people, from the folks that clean the streets to Uber drivers, other folks, about infrastructure in Mexico City and about all the different things that were broken. Because I remember at that time, there were a couple different funds that were investing in startups that were focused on like infrastructure throughout Latin America. And so that's something I was curious about. I was interviewing a couple folks, and there's no shortage of problems, right? There's always something that you can do. So for your expansion of Vaas outside of Colombia, how did that go when you're landing in other countries? Was there any issues that you guys encountered, anything that you had to consider? I know that a lot of startups that have expanded to other Latin American countries, a lot of them had to customize their product for those countries. How did that happen? Or like, how did that go for you all at Vaas?
So I started in Colombia partly because of the clients that I had, et cetera, and also because there wasn't the need of a notary in order for my platform to really show value. Going into Mexico was very difficult for me, primarily for two reasons. One, there was a lot more competition in Mexico than there was in Colombia, with like way more established players. So like trying to figure out is like, well, I trust this guy. And I'm like, and why do you trust that guy? So a lot of people were like, because I do and don't ask me more questions. And like, those were the people that that you couldn't innovate. And then there were the people that were like, oh, here's why. And I would ask a lot of questions about why and why and why. And that sort of just led to us building like an incredibly better product, which I don't think I've told you about the theory of the atom, that we have?
No, what's that?
Okay. So basically, the way in this, probably one of the
And
first
sorry,
few
you
times that
said
I'm
the fear of the atom?
the theory
Oh, the
of
theory
the
of the
atom.
atom. Oh,
So
okay.
do you know how Carta has the N of one like unit, which is like the smallest unit of share? It's or the smallest unit possible is the share. I think of as, and I basically copied this from them, but it's the smallest unit that I have is an asset. Doesn't matter if it's $1 or $10 or $100, but it basically has three components: documents that make the existence of the asset true or somewhat verifiable. Second, ownership. Who does it actually belong to? And then third one is payments. What we basically have to do by region, it's figure out where the assets or where the documents are custodied. Two, where the equivalent of the UCC by asset is in each country. So we have to make sure that the asset ownership we can verify. And then the third one, which is payments, that's where we've done also quite a lot of like, well, Colombia has its own payment gateways. Mexico has its own payment gateways or banks. By the way, there's no plaid in Latin America. So we still have to figure out how to get a way to get access to banks. And actually with some banks, we're starting to do like host to host connections. So that's really good to get like, figure out whether the money that it's sitting there is actually real and done a screenshot, not just in a screenshot that someone says through an email and if it hasn't been like, I don't know, changed by whatever tool that now you can just possibly tell if it's true or not. But basically these were my three components. One of that second component is ownership. In Latin America, in Mexico specifically, you need the notary in some cases to do that. What we're trying to do, and notaries will probably hate me for this, but it's try to remove them from the process of having them every single time that there's an assignment of rights to have them post a signature or the stamp. Is like, and you ask like, why do you need the notary to say yeah or to stamp it? It's like, well, because you need to have fecha cierta, because you need to have the date that it's right. And I'm like, well, isn't that what DocuSign gives you when you like go and click? Oh, well, because you need to know whether the person is the person that they say it is. It's like, okay, well, aren't there a lot of tools that allow you to like figure out whether that's the person that it actually is signing? So Mexico was difficult primarily because one, we had a lot of competition. And then two, the Mexico, in my opinion, is way more behind than in Colombia in terms of like these aspects. Perhaps as a market, they're bigger in terms of like debt issuance, they're way bigger. But in the infrastructure that allows my clients to operate on a daily basis, it's much better Colombia than it is in Mexico. And I'll add a third one, which is La Superintendencia, which is like the equivalent of the SEC in Colombia, because there's been a lot of frauds here in Colombia. They have put a lot of eyes on the trustees to make sure that they do the work that they have legally agreed to. Sometimes they cannot do it. So they've asked the third party always to come in. Versus in Mexico, the responsibility of a lot of the things that happen are much less. Especially they don't have La CNBV, the equivalent of the SEC in Mexico, to actually say, hey, show me the list of duties that you have. Show me where the assets are. Show me that you have checked them in X, Y, and Z. Like, I think like the regulatory bodies have also pushed us to improve a lot more in Colombia than in Mexico. So regulation is incredibly important, and regulate like innovation in the legal space, not in how these structures are made, because there's a lot to do there, but how these assets are transferred. Like, why in the world do you need a notary? Do you need to pay them $500 in order to make the asset transfer like perfected? Why? And then what I'm hopeful is that trustees can also catch up to this, because the problem is they were used to, like, for instance, I have a trustee in Mexico that only allows me to do one assignment per week. You can only assign rights once per week, so you can only remove cash out of the trust once per week.
And what is the reason that behind the limit for that?
Well, because they have their own like audit internal like system, una mesa de control. I don't know how to say this in English, but basically their own controls. So literally like they have to basically take out the 300-page documents. Like, can I do this here? Okay, it seems like I can go. And there's like 3 people checking a lot of these things. And I'm like, why can we not do an intelligent control system for these things. So I'm hopeful that at least one or two trustees will figure it out in each country.
Is the idea then to go kind of like country by country in Latin America, like wherever you kind of see the opportunity, introduce Vaas, and then like potentially expand outside of Latin America as well?
TBD. TBD. When that happens, I'll give you a call and give you another
Yeah.
podcast. What was the decision making behind that?
Yeah. I mean, I think if you're expanding into another country with a host of different problems, different regulatory environment and everything, like I think there's probably the best way to go about it is building out like a team, have like a country manager. Like is that what you guys ended up doing in Mexico? Like have people who really are on the ground kind of understand the intricacies of whatever the ecosystem is in Mexico versus you're more familiar with, or we're more familiar with Colombia?
I was surprisingly not more familiar with Mexican law than Colombian law, just purely because I did more deals there. But I had this one person that I met that had worked at a debt fund in Mexico, and he was basically like the boots on the ground person. But a lot of our meetings were like digital, like Zoom or Meets. And I think like for the future, like for the next countries, absolutely. I think at the beginning, like we had a lot of that internal knowledge from the internal, like the first team that we had.
And I want to ask you, this is moving a little bit away, getting a little bit more like personally, like what have been the hardest things like for you being a founder, a first time founder, being a young founder, and just over the past few years, what are the hardest things challenges you face? I think ways you've been able to overcome these challenges.
Like this whole thing about like founder mode that no one actually decides what it actually means, or at least if there's inconsistent. I have like this other thing, which is like naive founder mode, which is like
Naive founder mode.
And this was basically me. So I was like, the first year, I was like, yeah, we're going to get to 1 million of revenue. We're going to go very fast. We're like, and I remember David Haber was like, I think you have no idea about building a company. Like, that's not going to happen. I was like, well, I'm going to show you that I can. And so it was like this funny like moment that I remember. And it was like the second year, same thing. It's like the overestimation of like what you think that you can do. And honestly, like the first year I realized,
right?
Yeah, but I think it's optimism, but here's why I would call it naive. No one knew who I was. No one knew what Vaas was. So imagine I'm knocking the door. Hey, whatever fund or whatever bank or whatever trustee. Hey, we should work together. And they're like, and who are you? Who are your clients? Basically, this world moves around trust and like who trusts who. And basically what I figured out after the first year was like, man, we need to build trust. So what I would say is like my naive founder mode, that's probably where I had my biggest issues, which is like you overestimate how much you underestimate what the market will need in order for you to be successful, even if you have an incredible product.
Yeah. Yeah. And then that's also, I wanted to touch on kind of like, yeah, you're coming essentially first to market with this product, right? And it's like I'm sure the sales cycle is super long because you have to basically explain exactly how this is going to work, why, potential clients are going to need it, right? So like, I'm sure that kind of feeds into why maybe it wasn't such, as fast a start as like you had hoped.
Also, I didn't think that people care. I thought, oh, my clients cared about cash drag. Everyone is going to care about cash drag. And then I realized, no, like first of all, cash drag is a hidden opportunity cost. So it's very hard to calculate what the opportunity cost of the cash is, basically sitting in the account. The one way that I have seen people sort of calculate it is that sometimes they raise like a unsecured line of credit to basically get cash out before the trust releases the cash. Basically, they're getting a line of credit to finance the cash that is sitting in another account. Like, why? Like, it's just, why? So people, I think at the beginning, didn't care about that. And that was probably like the first thing that I realized was like, actually, this is like out of the list of priorities, it was like 9th or 10th, or if not 15th or 20th, or some people didn't know what cash rec meant. So
So it took a lot of like conversations, I guess, like with clients, potential clients, of like, what should be my priorities? Like, what are the problems, right?
and I think people like didn't understand or didn't hope that they could do more cash releases by signing more frequently, because what they have been told by everyone around the ecosystem, whether that be lawyers, trustees, or whoever, was like, no, once per week or once per month, that's okay. I was like, okay, wait, can we not change it?
That's interesting though. That reminds me of something a friend sent me from like YouTube or TikTok where they were saying like, yeah, you can pay your house off faster by if you just take a unsecured line of credit and then pay it off within, like 6 months or something, and then use that to pay off your mortgage and, make lump sum payments. I remember sitting there like, that makes no sense whatsoever. Like you're going to be paying probably more in interest. And me also, I love like math and modeling. So I literally one night I just sat down and modeled it out so I could send it over to my friend. And I was like, dude, look, like you're not going to be saving interest. You're actually going to be spending more. Like this makes no sense. So when you were talking about taking out a line of credit to finance cash that's sitting in another account, I was like, that sounds insane. You're just paying interest for no reason.
And what some people will have to do is they'll basically say, hey, I'll leave you money, let's say in the cork in the US. Like they'll put a DACA in $1 million, and then they'll do the $1 million like money being lent out. At the bottom. It's just like, there's just so much to fix in this world.
Well, looks like you got your hands full.
But now I accepted Tommy's LinkedIn request. So
yeah.
All right.
Well, there you go. Now he can
all hands on deck. So what is it kind of like right now in Colombia? Cyrus, maybe you can touch on this too. So like in Mexico, we noticed it's kind of like a fintech super center. Like right now, I think there's more fintechs coming out of like Mexico City than even there are in Brazil. Like we're there's a ton of energy, a lot of excitement, a lot of sort of opportunity, decent amount of funding options, even though I think fundraising is not going great. There are more VCs there than I think in Colombia for sure. What is kind of the ecosystem like in Colombia? Cyrus, you were also in Bogota for Tech Week. Maybe you can also, throw in some ideas, but would love to hear it because it seemed like there's a lot of like sort of momentum, at least with like startups and entrepreneurs in Colombia. But then it seems like a lot of them kind of like will move to other markets, like bigger markets.
Go ahead, first, Cyrus.
Yeah, well, I think he put it perfectly. I think when I was in Colombia, I think someone once said there was maybe 3 larger VC firms in Colombia, but it seemed like there were a lot of startups. For example, at one of the other startups I worked at, we actually started hiring engineers out of like Colombia they were in Bogota, Medellin, etc. Every time you go there, I feel like you always see some founder working on something new. I think the startup ecosystem is incredible, but it seems like a lot of those startups are either funded by angels or VCs that are outside of Colombia. So something that we were thinking about is what does that startup ecosystem look like, but also what is the funding, what does the funding or the investor ecosystem look like in Colombia? Because it seems like it's a lot of like money coming from outside of Colombia into the country. So kind of curious to get your thoughts on that.
Not sure if you guys know how to speak Spanish now after a couple months in. I think Tommy knows.
Tom's like fluent. I'm getting there.
I'll send you a podcast that I did with someone else. Basically, it's a VC, a Colombian VC, explaining a little bit more of the dynamics, so you can go into more of the details there. But in Mexico, and I'm not super well versed on this, so if someone knows that I'm making mistakes, please correct me. But in Mexico, a couple of years back, there was like a lot of push in order to create VCs. So there were like a lot of, I think it was like government incentives.
It was national level. Yeah, it was by the government.
Exactly. And they offered this like minimum, or I think max returns for the government, and then everything, like basically just like incentives everywhere to create this ecosystem. We have not had that in Colombia. There has been one big organization, Bancordix, that has become like the first or second check. I don't know the details, but there has become like a first check or a couple of checks in these VCs, but they're still very small. So I would probably separate from one side, like government incentives, nothing, at least at a national level, nothing that creates like capital infusion. The second one is pension funds, like as she would put it, as my friend would put it, they're like comfortable, or I don't remember what the word that she said, but it's like, why would I do all this work to put a couple $1 million when I have to manage all these billions? And
Yeah.
so there's a lot of like pension money isn't flowing to these types of things. And I think
And interest
pension
rates
money,
are what in Colombia?
and then the usury rate, like we can talk about that in another thing, but basically there hasn't been like pension funds investing into this asset class. So
Mm-hmm.
like, I think we should have more of that. So no government, no pension funds. And I think what is starting is, you saw like Colombia Tech Week. It was like incredible. Like, I think the startup ecosystem is like very much like growing. And I would say a lot of this comes from like what Rappi has done in Colombia. So
Mm-hmm.
I think what they did took forward the system in Colombia. And then the last part of it that's happening is at a regional level, like the mayors and the governors are actually investing a lot into the system. So I know Antioquia is doing, I know Bogotá is doing some, but I'm particularly from Cali, Valle del Cauca. And that's where NEO, which is the combination of the mayor and the governor. So like, which I found that incredibly helpful, that the city plus the state ish, that they could basically work together. I wish that basically all the governors and mayors of all Colombia, they could, I don't know, do something that's way bigger. But at least it's starting at a government local level, because the national level, it's not happening. I think they have other priorities. So I think that summarizes Colombia.
Yeah. No, that's great. That's great perspective. Yeah. It's going to take, I think, different types of efforts in every country in Latin America to grow, like maturity wise, to get even, close to, I guess, where the US is. There's a whole host of problems that are idiosyncratic. It's like very different for each country, but it's just very interesting to see. And that's why one of the reasons we're so interested in Latin America is just so dynamic. And there's a lot of interesting stuff, a lot of opportunities, but like a lot of problems, not just at the tech level, but government, financing, and otherwise. But yeah, love to hear your insights on that. So thank you.
Yeah. And that was a great explanation too, by the way, because I've asked a lot of people that. And that was a well thought out and very detailed explanation. So thank you.
Well, I had to write it down. Otherwise, as you know, like I would be like going like everywhere on this explanation. I just laugh a lot.
You heard it here first on La Frontera podcast. Well, Valentina, thank you so much for your time here. This was like a scintillating conversation. And I think you guys have a podcast, right? Like you're putting out, and you put out a lot of content. So for anyone, interested in debt markets and just finance in general, like you put out a lot of great content, a lot of learning opportunities. You guys have a podcast though too, right?
Yeah, we called it All You Can Debt. So we talked to you. The first episode was with Patricia from EWA, which I think it's probably one of the, I love this fund. And that was the first person that I spoke to. And she was the one telling me about this, like how Mexico started. So Cyrus, if you're interested in hearing more, like she can tell you more because she knows she's the one raising the LP money.
Perfect.
And then the second one was with Alejo Arenas from CIM. He's basically like the lead person for, not sure if LatAm, but basically he's like the lead person that lives in Bogotá, and they're starting to create, I don't know. Good. Listen to the episode. Tired.
Also,
And then the third one, it's actually going to be very interesting. Or the fourth one, which is going to be with a lawyer that tells us like legal improvements.
Also, I want to call out that your LinkedIn posts are hilarious. So if you guys ever have a chance, go read her LinkedIn posts as well.
Thank you.
We won't accept your request, but you can follow her. All right. Thank you so much, Valentina.
Yeah, thank you so much.
No,
Really
thank you
appreciate
guys. I enjoyed this a lot.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode of La Frontera. We hope you enjoyed the show. You can listen to more great conversations on our Spotify, as well as on your other favorite streaming platforms. You can find us online at lafronterapodcast.com, and make sure to subscribe to our newsletter for show notes and to stay in the loop for new content. Ciao for now.